You may have lived a life that looked right, but it wasn't a life that was real. From the earliest days, you were taught to behave, to be polite, to be humble, to work hard, to live for others. You entered adulthood carrying a checklist of goals you never wrote yourself. Pass the entrance exam, get a good job, buy a house, settle down, get married. You called it success. Society applauded. Everyone nodded. But quietly, beneath the applause and the neatness, something in you went dark. And that something was your subjectivity, your ability to live as the origin of your own experience. Over time, you stopped experiencing life as a fluid stream of becoming. You started existing as a system of conditioned responses. If others are happy, you smile. If others are irritated, you adjust. You started to operate like an artificial OS, constantly updating, constantly patching, just to fit in, just to survive, just to not cause trouble. And here's the question you've probably never asked out loud. When did you start fearing other people's opinions more than honoring your own? When did you start treating other people's gaze as the only mirror that could tell you you're okay? This is not about who you live for. This is about whether you still remember why you live at all. The more you trained yourself to adapto, shift, to shrink, to soften, the more you lost your orientation. You didn't know where you were going. You only knew you hadn't been left behind. You hadn't been criticized. You hadn't been disliked. But neither did you feel alive. And this is the most insidious form of self-erasure. You breathe. You work. You interact. You love. But deep down, you are completely severed from your inner essence. It is a form of death that walks, smiles, and pays taxes. It is a man whose soul has gone silent so gradually that he doesn't remember what it sounded like. Michel de Montaigne saw this coming 5 centuries ago. He didn't write about how to win friends and influence people. He wasn't interested in strategies for success. He looked into the human soul and saw the same fear that haunts men today, the existential vulnerability under the gaze of others, and the terror of being abandoned if one lives authentically. But Montaigne didn't call us to rebel. He didn't urge us to renounce the world like hermits or iconoclasts. He made a gentler, deeper invitation. Sit with yourself long enough to remember what is real. And when you do, you'll be shocked to realize most of the goals you thought were yours were actually just reactions. Your ambition was a plea for praise. Your self-restraint was a strategy to avoid rejection. Your calmness wasn't depth, it was fear of disappointing others. You've been living as if there's an invisible jury scoring your every action. You wake up each day to perform in their courtroom, to meet expectations. But you never stop to ask, whose expectations are these? Who wrote the rules? Is there any space left in your life where you're not being measured? You have been shaped not by love of truth, but by the fear of disapproval. You are no longer a man who lives. You are a man who calibrates. And this is the disease of modern man. He becomes so competent at being acceptable that he forgets how to be real. He loses his wildness. He loses his flame. He becomes a mirror for others, but never a window to his own soul. You weren't born to live on autopilot. You weren't born to be efficient. You were born to become, to unfold, to walk, stumble, and blaze your way into something only you could name. But if you live only to fit, you will never find. The question is not whether you are succeeding in their eyes. The question is whether you are still there, behind your eyes. And if that presence is dimmed, the path back begins not with ambition, but with silence, with solitude, with sitting long enough with your unlabeled self to hear the voice that has not spoken since you were a boy. That voice is not loud. It will not shout over notifications, but it waits. And it is the only voice that knows your name. Existential philosophy calls this condition the alienation of being, the gradual erosion of your subjectivity, the slow replacement of yourself with a performance that never ends. Every decision filtered through the question, how will this be perceived? Every value handed to you from the outside. Every wound inflicted not by events, but by the simple act of not being recognized. And in such a state, true freedom becomes a luxury, almost an illusion. You cannot live deeply if you are still paralyzed by the gaze of others. You cannot become yourself if you've never risked being misunderstood. You cannot mature if you are still waiting for someone to give you permission to live the life that only you know is yours. Freedom does not begin when you dare to be different. Freedom begins when you no longer need anyone to tell you you're on the right path. Montaigne taught that life is an interior act. Unseen, unapplauded, uncelebrated. There is no stage, no trophy, no clapping crowd. There is only you and the quiet clarity of knowing. I have nothing left to prove. I do not live to be loved. I live to be real. And the letting go Montaigne speaks of is not coldness, it is a form of wisdom. The wisdom that knows. No external achievement is worth the cost of your inner peace. No relationship is sustainable if you must distort your own nature just to remain desirable. Think about it. How many years of your life have been spent seeking approval? How much of your energy has been exhausted in the pursuit of being liked? And what did you actually receive? Was it connection? Or was it an unspoken contract? I'll be the version of me you prefer and you'll allow me to stay? Because here is the truth that wounds before it heals. If you still have to make yourself easier to love just to be accepted, then you were never truly loved. You were merely tolerated. That's not connection. That's survival. That's not intimacy. That's negotiation. And in such spaces, your soul will wither. We are not meant to be shaped to fit. We are meant to grow into our own shape, unapologetically, imperfectly, vividly. And if someone cannot meet you there, in your truth, then their love was never for you. It was for the costume you wore. And no matter how convincing the costume, one day it will tear, and you will be alone again. But this time, you'll be closer to yourself. And if you have never truly allowed yourself to live even one day without the need to be liked, without bending your voice to please the ears of others, without looking around for nods of approval after each word you speak, then you have not yet tasted life in its raw, unfiltered form. You have existed, yes. You have functioned. You have been appropriate. But you have not yet lived. You do not yet know the magnitude of what has been lost. Because you've been busy earning your right to exist in rooms that never asked for your fullness, only for your obedience. Your entire life has been shaped not by what is essential in you, but by what was expected of you. And when the essential is abandoned long enough in favor of the expected, something inside collapses silently, invisibly, but with devastating consequence. You live in a world where being seen is everything. But to be seen on terms that are not your own is a form of spiritual exile. Since you were a child, you were taught the myth that recognition is love. That applause is belonging. That fitting in is the same as being real. And so you complied. You learned to minimize your edges, to sand down your desires, to make your presence digestible. You learned to smile before you spoke, and to apologize before you even knew if you had done anything wrong. But tell me now quietly, privately, if no one else will listen, whose life have you been living? You have dreams, but are they yours? You have values, but are they inherited, borrowed, copied? You have relationships, but are you truly known in theme or only accepted on the condition that you don't change the temperature in the room? You think you have goals, but what you actually have are terms of survival. I will be liked if I behave. I will be loved if I perform. I will belong if I never disappoint. You mistake compliance for connection. You mistake politeness for peace. You mistake approval for presence. And then one day, in the middle of a conversation, or during a celebration, or just walking through the world with a coffee in hand, you will feel it. A subtle, growing ache. Not for company, not for success, not even for love, but for yourself. Because you have not abandoned others. You've abandoned you. You do not feel empty because something is missing from your life. You feel empty because you are missing from your life. And here lies the most tragic irony. The world congratulates you. They call you balanced. They call you mature. They say you're doing well. But the truth? You have become invisible in your own story. This is not just about mental health. This is about ontological betrayal. The slow erosion of your being in exchange for applause that never reaches your soul. The existential philosophers saw this long before social media amplified it. To be liked is not the same as to be known. To be accepted is not the same as to be seen. Montaigne, in his radical 16th century solitude, understood this paradox. He did not ask men to rebel against the world. He did not preach grand revolutions. He simply said, sit with yourself long enough that you remember what is real. Real, not curated. Real, not rehearsed. Real, not reshaped to match a culture that fears rawness. You were not made to be pleasant. You were made to be whole. You were not made to be agreeable. You were made to be awake. And perhaps the time has come for you to stop rehearsing a life that earns applause and start living a life that makes you nod in recognition and say, yes, that's me. Because if you don't, if you continue chasing being liked like it is salvation, you may wake up one day and realize the most devastating truth of all. Everyone around you admired the mask, but no one ever loved the man. You have lived what appears to be a good life by all external measures, a correct one. You were taught from an early age to behave, to be polite, to suppress chaos for the sake of peace, to dim your fire in exchange for approval. You followed the map. Good grades, a respectable job, a stable home, a dependable partner. You checked the boxes, each one marked with society's quiet applause. And somewhere along that journey, something in you went quiet. Not broken, not rebellious, just quiet. That silence? That was your subjectivity withering the part of you that does not act in reaction to others, but moves from its own center of gravity. At some point, you stopped living as an origin and became an echo. Someone laughs, and you smile. Someone frowns, and you adjust. You became a shapeshifter in the name of survival. You became adaptable, likable, unproblematic. And yet, somewhere in the folds of that perfected self, a question remains. Do you still remember why you're alive? This is not a moral question. This is not a question about productivity or contribution or even happiness. It is a metaphysical wound, one that only bleeds in silence. And silence is precisely what you've been trained to avoid. You check your phone before your feet hit the ground in the morning. You fill every pause with noise. Not because you are lazy or lost, but because you are terrified that if all the sound stopped, you might hear something you cannot bear. You no longer recognize yourself. You have become a set of responses to an invisible panel of judges, family, lovers, strangers, algorithms. You have become an internal employee of public opinion. You measure your worth by engagement, by praise, by compliance. Montaigne saw this centuries ago. He didn't write self-help manuals. He didn't teach strategies for personal branding. He refused to teach people how to become more palatable. Instead, he locked himself in a tower and asked, over and over, "What in me is real?" He wrote not to convince others, but to confront himself. And through that inner confrontation, he left behind a legacy of radical clarity, that we suffer not from life, but from our unexamined assumptions of how life should be. He warned, if you do not learn to sit with yourself long enough, society will hand you a script, and you will perform that script until the day you die, believing it is your voice. But it isn't. This is the quiet violence of alienation, not political, but ontological. Not from the world, but from yourself. And now we arrive at the question no one else can answer for you. Whose life are you living? Because if you have not yet lived one day without performing, If you have not yet dared to speak even one sentence without worrying how it will be received, then you have never truly lived. You have merely survived the expectations of others. And no matter how mature or respectable that may look on the outside, on the inside it is spiritual suffocation. You were not born for this. You were not born to optimize every moment for productivity. You were not born to curate an existence that feels consistent to others. You were born to live from the inside out. And the tragedy is that you almost remember. You almost remember what it felt like to move without shame, to cry because something mattered, to love something without asking if it was acceptable. That part of you, childlike, instinctual, unfiltered, is not died. It waits. It waits beneath the layers of strategy. It waits beneath the applause. It waits beneath your performance of strength, your rehearsed smiles, your socially acceptable anxiety. It waits in silence. And silence is where the return must begin. Because the question is not, what should I do? It is, who am I when I stop trying to be impressive? What remains when I'm no longer trying to be liked? This is not about rebellion. This is not about being misunderstood. This is about returning to the sovereign kingdom of the self, where your values are not decorations but bones, where your desires are not edited but trusted, where your life is not a project but a presence. And it will not be easy. You will lose people. You will lose the version of yourself that made others comfortable. You will lose the safety of being predictable, pleasing, and pleasant. But what you gain is your soul. And with that soul, you will finally stop asking the world for permission to exist. You will stop asking your parents for retroactive approval. You will stop asking your partner to validate your worth. You will stop asking strangers to agree with your path. You will stand in the center of your own being alone, if necessary, and say, I am not here to be understood. I am here to be true. And in that truth, something ancient begins to wake. Not a brand, not a personality, but a pulse, a rhythm, a homecoming. And once that begins, no applause can seduce you, and no rejection can break you. Because you have stopped living for the world's mirror, and started living as the flame that lights its own sky. This is what existential freedom truly means. Not freedom from society, but freedom from the shadow you have mistaken for yourself. The shadow made from expectation, from moral training, from the gaze of others. The kind of freedom Montaigne recognized not as a revolution, but as a quiet, inner unfolding. Not a slogan, not a rebellion, but a posture in which you begin, moment by moment, to live without the need to always do it right. Because Montaigne saw long before the age of social media or self-help that no one is forcing you to wear the mask. You wear it because you're afraid that if you take it off, you will be left behind. He wasn't asking us to stop fearing judgment. He was asking us to gather the courage to stop betraying ourselves if it means others walk away. At the heart of Montaigne's quiet wisdom lies one of the foundational questions of all existential philosophy. Why do we let the fear of what others might think define the shape of our entire life? This is not merely a psychological inquiry, it is ontological. Because when a person no longer dares to show up as who they are, what's at stake is not just dignity, but existence itself. When another person's gaze becomes your internal compass, your decisions cease to be yours. Your emotions no longer belong to you. You begin to live like a tenant in your own life, constantly rehearsing, editing, moderating, as if your days were a performance for a silent audience you're not even sure exists. And therein lies the tragedy. We construct our own prison, brick by brick. A prison made from expectation, sealed with the cement of comparison, and locked by the iron bars of our fear of rejection. Montaigne, writing in the 16th century, saw something many modern people don't feel until midlife. We do not suffer because of what we lack. We suffer because of what we believe we must have. No one ever told you that you must succeed. No one ever demanded that you be admired. No one required you to look impressive. But the moment you internalized these as conditions for having a life of worth, you unconsciously chained yourself to a race with no finish line. Montaigne did not ask us to become aloof, detached, or indifferent. He invited us to enter life more fully, with clarity and courage. The courage to stop hiding. The courage to stop performing. The courage to simply show up imperfect, contradictory, flawed, but real. True freedom does not come from escaping responsibility. It comes from reclaiming your inner authority. When you no longer act out of fear, when your choices are no longer about dodging criticism, when your life no longer orbits around being palatable, then even if you do the same job, live the same life, you become a different man. A man who is awake. A man who no longer reacts, but chooses. And from that place, something miraculous begins to unfold. When you let go, you do not become weak. You become light. You begin to walk through the world without the unbearable weight of pretense. You stop negotiating every word, every look, every move, and suddenly, relationships feel clearer. Your purpose becomes quieter but firmer. You stop trying to be understood because you have understood yourself. This is existential sovereignty. Living from the center of your being, rather than at the mercy of external winds. Yes, people will misunderstand you. Yes, you may be seen as cold, or arrogant, or selfish. But those labels will no longer land because you know where you stand, because you no longer need others to mirror your worth. And let us be clear, this is not arrogance. This is the sacred confidence of a man who has looked his soul in the face and did not flinch. So if you ask, where do I begin? You begin in silence. You begin by taking off the mask not for others, but for yourself. You begin by realizing that being loved is not as important as being true. You begin by remembering that you were not born to be pleasing. You were born to be whole. And the world, yes, even the world that once misunderstood, you will slowly adjust. Not because you chased validation, but because you finally stopped asking for it. And when that moment comes, when you feel yourself returning to your original shape, the man before conditioning, before comparison, before performance, you will not need applause. You will not need permission. You will only need presence. And in that presence, you will rediscover a freedom that cannot be taught, only remembered. That lightness you feel is not the carelessness of escapism. It is the sacred lightness of someone who no longer needs to run. You don't need to run toward standards. You don't need to run away from yourself. You don't need to run laps around someone else's mind, trying to guess, am I okay yet? It is the stillness of a man who has finally admitted, I don't need to be right. I only need to be real. I don't need to be loved. I only need to stop betraying myself. The modern world, a civilization of performance. We live in a postmodern world where every person is a personal brand, where social media has transformed us all into actors, directors, and producers, curating not just moments, but selves. In such a world, the choice to stop performing is no longer just a lifestyle preference. It is a radical act. It is a rebellion of the soul. To stop decorating yourself, to stop adjusting your personality for palatability, to stop explaining every action so others won't misunderstand, is not merely a return to yourself. It is an act of resistance against a system designed to keep you perpetually unworthy. Because if you ever truly feel enough, you will stop consuming. If you feel enough, you will stop competing. If you feel enough, you will stop sprinting for approval. And in that moment, you will become dangerous. Because you will no longer be manipulable. You are no longer for sale. Michel de Montaigne didn't ask you to become a philosopher. He asked something far harder. Sit down. Stay. Be with yourself. No podcast. No TikTok. No new updates. Just you and the question. If no one were watching, would I still be me? Let that question break you. Because what comes after that breaking is real. Letting go is not giving up. It is a return. Montaigne taught us, letting go is not the same as withdrawal from life. It is the refusal to keep chasing illusions about life. It is the quiet homecoming to something smaller, but truer. A life that does not need to be loud. A life that does not need to be inspiring. A life that does not need to prove itself to be worth living. It is a shift from the grand to the grounded. It is a decision to no longer perform aliveness, but to feel it directly, vulnerably, unmistakably. It is a life where peace is no longer a luxury. It is a non-negotiable, because the truth is, the world around you thrives on your insecurity, on your fear of missing out, on your self-doubt, repackaged as motivation, on your hunger to be seen, sold back to you as content. And when you no longer chase any of it, you walk away, not with emptiness, but with space. The space to breathe, to think, to re-become. And that is the greatest danger to a world that profits off your disconnection. A man who has come home to himself. A life where you can walk without needing to take a picture. Where you can be silent without feeling invisible. Where you can fail without your self-worth collapsing. Where you can speak what you believe and allow the world to respond however it must. That is the mark of a free man. Not because he fears nothing, but because he has accepted that some fears are no longer worth carrying. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of modern life is not that we suffer too deeply, but that we are suffocated by things far too small. Michel de Montaigne, from the quiet of his 16th century tower, observed this long before us. He saw how human beings chain themselves to the trivial, the obsessive worry over what others think, the quiet grudges that never get named but shape entire decades, the deep insecurities camouflaged beneath politeness, achievement, and charm. We worry about how we enter a room. We rewind every conversation in our minds. We cling to people who no longer see us. And the strangest thing is we know it's unimportant. Somewhere in us, we know that if we could just step back, just zoom out, most of our fears are small, fleeting, and not worthy of the peace they rob. And then the paradox begins. The harder you cling, the faster it slips away. The more you try to please, the further they drift. The tighter you grip a problem, the more entangled you become. But when you let go, truly let go, when you stop being possessed by obsession, life begins to move again. This is no accident. It's the signature of a deeper law that Montaigne understood. When you release, life returns to its natural rhythm. When you soften, you re-enter the current of reality, a current that does not rush, does not tense, and does not break. But why are we so afraid of that current? Because most of us believe, often unconsciously, that if we stop caring, we will lose our motivation. That if we let go, we will become passive, lazy, indifferent. That not caring is the same as spiritual laziness. This is one of the most tragic misunderstandings of our time. Letting go, in the spirit of Montaigne, is not apathy. It is not checking out of life. On the contrary, it is a deeply philosophical act. It is the redirection of mental energy away from the petty and toward the meaningful. It is the quiet courage to release what no longer serves your soul, so that you may finally enter a life that is lighter but far deeper. Letting go is not the end of care. It is the beginning of care for the right things, for the parts of you that do not need performance, for the voice that has been drowned out by approval seeking, for the truth that doesn't need to impress, only to exist. And Montaigne, gentle and sharp in equal measure, did not ask you to abandon the world. He asked you to abandon your prison inside it. He asked you to stop measuring yourself by scales you didn't build, to stop running simulations of conversations no one will ever replay, to stop mistaking anxiety for engagement, to stop calling your people-pleasing kindness. He asked you to pause long enough to see clearly, long enough to realize that the storm is not outside, it's inside, and it quiets when you stop fanning it. Imagine this for a moment. If you no longer had to manage every detail, if you no longer had to get every decision right, if you no longer had to please every person in your life, how light would you feel? We are exhausted, not because life is inherently cruel, but because we spend our entire existence resisting what is. We wear ourselves down trying to forecast the unpredictable, micromanage the uncontrollable, and preempt the unknowable. All our every spreadsheet, every backup plan, every just in case, is not really about prudence. It is a rebellion against reality, a quiet refusal to accept the simplest truth, that a large part of this life will never be within our grasp. And the more we deny that, the more fatigued we become. Not because life demands it, but because we demand that life become something it is not. Montaigne, clear-eyed and centuries ahead of his time, never told us to surrender our will. He never asked us to stop acting. What he proposed was something more radical: to shift the axis of our inner life from control to comprehension, from anxiety to alignment, from resistance to resonance. Not acceptance in the modern pop spiritual sense of passivity, but a deeper philosophical acceptance, to know the rules of this game so you can play it with grace instead of strain. He reminds us gently, firmly, that every great thinker, artist, or visionary was once misunderstood, rejected, and lost. But they did not let that define them. They kept going, not because they were sure they would win, but because they saw something real, and they walked toward it. And here is the miracle that follows. When you stop asking for permission to be yourself, you start becoming magnetic. When you stop spending energy on being palatable, you begin to shine. Not because you tried to glow, but because you stopped dimming your own light.